Lord Butler has had a remarkably successful career. He started at University College at Oxford, where he earned 2 firsts. For those of you who've been in Great Britain, you know that's a remarkable academic distinction. He also won awards on the rugby field. He went on to a career in public service. The academic success helps in public service. Doesn't hurt to be a rugby player either. He worked for Treasury, worked for the Bank of England. He held a number of posts in the British Civil Service and rose to its highest ranks, serving as personal secretary to several prime ministers, as cabinet secretary to Margaret Thatcher, John Major, and Tony Blair. When he left that position, he became a member of the House of Lords and the master at University College. That's the equivalent of the college president. There, he and his wife, Jill, got to know a number of Washington and Lee students and a number of Washington and Lee faculty who took advantage of the long-standing exchange between our 2 institutions. While he was serving at University College, he was asked by the British government to lead an inquiry into the decisions that led to the war in Iraq. It was the second of 3 major inquiries that the British have done on that subject. It's so popular, they keep coming back to it. The current inquiry is underway and involves televised testimony. Tony Blair will soon be appearing live. You can watch on C-SPAN, my colleague Bill Conley tells me, as they again recount what it is that led to the decision to go to war in Iraq. Our guest knows about as much about that subject as anyone. As he was proceeding with his inquiry, there were headlines in The Guardian that said, Butler attacks government. There were headlines in the Daily Telegraph that said, Butler waters down report to save Blair. If you offend all the major newspapers in Great Britain, it means you're doing a good job. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Robin Butler.
Thanks, Bob.
You need to turn your switch.
I've done it. Well, Bob, thank you very, very much for that very generous introduction. I'm not quite sure what you meant when you said it was no disadvantage in my government career to be a rugby player, but there were certainly moments when I can remember that having sharper shoulders and being able to run faster than those I was working with did turn out to be an advantage. But can I just say, as it were, before I get into the subject, because it's the last chance I'll probably have to do it publicly, to say how thrilled and honoured I am to have had the privilege of being given an honorary degree by Washington and Lee University. I appreciate it not only for the distinction which this famous university has conferred on me, but because it's a university which has had a special kinship with the college that I was at, both as student and master, over many years, and the links between us are close. And for that reason, too, I hugely value it. And now, as Bob has said, I was asked to chair this review of the intelligence on weapons of mass destruction. It happened on the 2nd of February of 2004, when my wife and I were at the pyramids called Teotihuacan outside Mexico City. And we were there because actually we didn't want to be there at all. We wanted to be in Houston, but we hadn't been able to go to Houston because the final of the Super Bowl was going on there. And we were going to Houston because we wanted to go to George Bush Sr.'s museum, as at that time I was raising money for a Churchill museum in London, and we wanted to see the George Bush Museum as a model. Anyway, on the way back from Teotihuacan into Mexico City, the mobile phone of the young lady who was our guide rang in the car. And she was sitting in the front of the car, we were sitting in the back, and she answered it, and she looked rather puzzled. And she said, "I think this must be for you, because the caller says they're ringing from 10 Downing Street." And so I said I thought it must be, and so she handed the telephone back to me, and it was an old friend, one of the lady secretaries at 10 Downing Street, to whom I gossiped for a few minutes. And then she said, Jonathan Powell, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, wants to have a word with you. And so she handed the phone, so she had put me through, and Jonathan Powell came on the line, and he said, Robin, your country needs you again. And at that moment, we went between two hills, and the transmission cut out. But it wasn't altogether difficult to speculate what they might need me for, because 2 days before, George W. Bush had announced the establishment of the Rob Silverman Commission in the United States to look into the mystery of why it was when one of the main reasons why the Allies had gone to war in Iraq was to stop Saddam Hussein's WMD program, that when the Allies got in and had been able to search, no WMD had been found. And Tony Blair had said he didn't want to have any more inquiries into Iraq, but when George W. Bush announced his inquiry, the pressure in the UK became irresistible, and I was asked to do it. And so as we were speculating, as we reached this correct conclusion, as we were driving back to our hotel in Mexico City, my wife said, don't touch it with a barge pole. This is an absolutely poisoned chalice, and you won't please anybody by the report that you do. But I found it irresistible. I found it irresistible out principally of vanity, but also I like to think that it really was the most genuine puzzle, because of all this intelligence fiascos, really, perhaps of all time, this must have been the greatest. The American intelligence community, the British intelligence community, the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence community, the Russians, the French, though they denied it subsequently, all believed that Saddam had these weapons, and he turned out not to have. And so the puzzle for me, who'd been involved with intelligence while in my government service, of why everybody had got it so wrong, was irresistible. And to be truthful, it was irresistible to our intelligence community as well, because they were not only embarrassed, but they were puzzled. And they themselves realized that they'd got lessons to learn about why this huge mistake had been made. Let me just remind you of the background. At the end of the first Gulf War, after Saddam Hussein invaded Iraq and had been expelled from it, the Security Council of the United Nations passed a resolution to ban Iraq from having chemical or biological weapons, or from further work to acquire nuclear weapons. It was known, of course, that Saddam had had such weapons. He'd used chemical weapons in the war against Iran, and he had also used them against his own people, the Kurds. At the end of that first Gulf War in 1991, to the horror of the West, it had been discovered that he was within a year of having a nuclear device. And all that was destroyed by the UN inspectors. In 1995, his son-in-law, Kamil Hussein, defected from Iraq and brought news and evidence, which the Iraqis subsequently had to confess to, that Saddam had a biological weapons program. In 1997, Saddam threw the United Nations inspectors out of Iraq, and after that, the West was, in that respect, blind to what was going on. And President Clinton, with the support of the British government, launched the Desert Fox operation to bomb Iraq and to try to destroy from the air the facilities which were suspected of being part of the UN, of the weapons of mass destruction program. Now, for the British, even in that period, before 9/11, there was great concern about the danger that Saddam Hussein represented in the Middle East. Not just that he was a monster who had used these terrible weapons not only against his enemies, but against his own people, that he had been guilty of what amounted within his own country to something that could have been described as genocide, that he was ill-disposed towards the West. All that made the British government very seriously worried about Saddam. And Tony Blair had, before 9/11 happened, made speeches where he had not urged military action, but he had urged sanctions and a tightening up of the sanctions against Iraq, and had advocated that the Iraqi people should themselves take action to rid themselves of this terrible man. And that was the position up to before 9/11. And at the time of 9/11, the sanctions were already breaking down. Saddam had persuaded the United Nations to introduce the oil for food program in Iraq, of which the purpose was that they could sell oil provided that they used the proceeds for food and medical supplies. Well, if one was to suppose that Saddam would stick to the terms of that, one was very naive indeed. And our intelligence knew that huge sums of money were being siphoned off that program by Saddam Hussein, and so he had huge resources available to him to acquire and develop a weapons system. We also knew two other things. One was that the A.Q. Khan network in Pakistan, A.Q. Khan, the developer of the nuclear weapon of Pakistan, had sold nuclear technology to North Korea and was available to sell it to anybody else who was in the market for it. And Saddam had the resources to be in the market for it. So there were reasons for concern that with the United Nations inspectors out of the way, he might be again returning to the development of a nuclear program. But we didn't have any very firm information about that. And we also knew that the position in the Middle East was made unstable by the fact that there was a great deal of enriched uranium and other nuclear facilities that were lying about in the former Soviet Union, disemployed nuclear scientists, all of whom might have been open to bids from somebody with money, and Saddam had it, to get that material. So we started worried. And then 9/11 happened. Now we know that following 9/11, there were those within the US administration who immediately pressed the President, George W. Bush, to take action against Iraq. And that initially he resisted that action. The Allies directed their attention towards Afghanistan, understandably, because that's where the Taliban had been giving shelter to Al-Qaeda. The invasion of Afghanistan took place. The Taliban were overthrown, but Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden took to the hills and were not rooted out, and Osama bin Laden couldn't be caught. And we also know, though the British didn't know it at the time, that in November, 2 months after 9/11, George W. Bush gave orders for the first time for a contingency plan to be produced for a possible invasion of Iraq. Now, why did George W. Bush at that moment tip over, having resisted the pressure from those within his administration beforehand to take action against Iraq? Why did he tip over towards doing it? There's been a lot of speculation about that. Speculation that it was to do with oil, speculation that it was to do with contracts. I have no firm knowledge of that, but I don't believe it was either of those things. I think that if you put yourself in the shoes of President Bush 2 months after 9/11, when the American people had been so traumatized by that terrible attack, indeed the world had been, and the forces had gone into Afghanistan, had defeated the Taliban, but hadn't caught the main perpetrators of that attack, I think that at that point it was politically impossible for George W. Bush not to contemplate further action. As it's rather vulgarly put in Bob Woodward's book, but I think it's very near the truth, if you couldn't kick Osama bin Laden's ass, you had to find somebody's ass you could kick. And that person was Saddam Hussein. Now, as I say, we, the British, didn't know that. At least, I don't think we did. I'm not privy to what might have gone on the hotline between George W. Bush and Tony Blair. But I have seen the British government papers, and what's clear from that is that the first time that the British got serious warning of the possibility of the Americans contemplating military action against Iraq was from the State of the Union speech on January the 31st, 2002. And that was the famous Axis of Evil speech in which Iraq was mentioned as one of the 3 countries in the Axis of Evil. And that rang the alarm bells in London. And our government started preparing papers, and those papers were presented to Tony Blair. And the most significant things about the papers that were presented to Tony Blair at that time was that the advice was that there was no legal justification for military intervention in Iraq, either on grounds of self-defense under the United Nations Charter, or to prevent genocide, which Saddam might have been guilty of in the past, but there was no evidence that he was contemplating it at that point, and so the only justification could be to enforce the Security Council resolutions that had come at the end of the first Gulf War 12 years before. And those resolutions were resolutions that banned weapons of mass destruction, and so the only basis, in our view, in international law for military action against Iraq was if Saddam was indeed flouting those resolutions and had weapons of mass destruction, had a chemical weapons program, biological weapons program, and was developing a nuclear weapons program. And our papers went on to say to Tony Blair, but at this point, we do not have the intelligence that would enable us to say with any confidence that that is happening. And so that put Tony Blair in a bit of a fix. Because, and I don't think there was anything dishonorable about this, he sincerely took the view, and we'll hear about this when he appears before the inquiry that's going on in Britain now, he sincerely took the view that the world would be better without Saddam Hussein in power in Iraq. And if the Americans were disposed to take action to get rid of Saddam Hussein, Tony Blair wanted to be part of it. Not simply because he was a toady to the Americans, as some people have suggested, but because he was genuinely sympathetic to the cause. He was concerned about terrorism in the Middle East. He was concerned about the disruptive force that Saddam Hussein represented in that tinderbox, and he felt, and I've got a considerable sympathy for this feeling, that if the Americans were going to act, he would want to be part of it and would want to be supportive. But he had this dilemma. Our view was that there was no legal justification for it unless it was we could establish that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. And that was the position when Tony Blair went to visit George W. Bush at Crawford in May of 2003. And on that visit, Tony Blair had three objectives as far as George W. Bush was concerned. One, he wanted to convey to George W. Bush that the British could only support the Americans if it was to enforce the Security Council resolutions, and this required establishing that there was a weapons of mass destruction program in Iraq. The second was that, and that involved going through the United Nations. The second was that he tried to use the leverage of British support to persuade George W. Bush to take a further initiative to solve the Israel-Palestinian dispute, what became known as the roadmap. And the third was that the two countries should make a joint intelligence effort to try and find out what was going on in Iraq and to be able to present that evidence to the public. And so that was in May of 2003. Again, there's some speculation in Britain, which is being covered by this review, what was the degree of commitment that Blair gave to Bush. Did Blair say to Bush, "We are with you whatever happens," or did he say, "We are with you conditionally"? And he will argue that he said, "We are with you conditionally," but many people think that he was actually, at that point, absolutely committed to military action if that's what came about. So in the September of 2002, the British published their evidence, what has become known in our jargon as the dossier, of our intelligence community's assessment of whether Saddam had got and was developing weapons of mass destruction. And that famously said, Tony Blair said in his introduction, "I think that without doubt our intelligence has established that Saddam has got a program of this sort, that he has got stocks of chemical and biological weapons and is developing nuclear." The American government published an intelligence estimate at about the same time, which came to similar conclusions. These were taken to the United Nations. I'm not now talking about Colin Powell's famous presentation, which was 6 months later. They were taken to the United Nations, and the Security Council was persuaded to pass Resolution 1441, where they demanded the reintroduction of UN inspectors into Iraq and threatened serious consequences if Saddam didn't comply with the United Nations thing. They did not use the UN formula for war, which was that the Security Council would take all necessary action if Saddam didn't comply. And this was a diplomatic fudge. And on that turns the issue about whether the military action was in fact legal or not. And both sides in that knew what they were doing. The Russians and the French wouldn't agree to the resolution saying that the Security Council would take all necessary means. The British and the Americans therefore settled for serious consequences, knowing that they would interpret that as military action if necessary, and other members of the Security Council might not, as indeed subsequently they didn't. Hans Blix went into Iraq in the fall of 2002, believing, as he said in his book, that indeed Saddam did have these weapons and set about looking for them. And the British and the American made available their intelligence. They suggested to Hans Blix where he should go and look. Everywhere that Hans Blix went, the Iraqis put up obstacles in the way. Overhead intelligence showed that very often when the UN inspectors came to the front door of a plant, there were people scuttling out of the back, holding boxes. Sometimes they went to places and there would be a demonstration, which made it impossible for the inspectors to dig in the sand to see if there was anything hidden there. The inspectors would have to come back 2 or 3 days later and ensure they'd dig, and then nothing would be found. So there were a lot of suspicious, perhaps more than suspicious signs. But as time went on, over that winter, Hans Blix and the inspectors developed more and more doubts about whether there was anything to be found. And in the spring of 2003, Hans Blix reported back to the United Nations, said nothing had been found, and asked for extra time. By that time, the American and the British forces were massed on the frontier. It was really impossible to keep them there during the Iraqi summer. They weren't able to agree to extra time, and then, as we know, on the 18th of April, the hostilities began. Saddam was very quickly toppled. The Iraq Survey Group was put in to look for the weapons of mass destruction, was there still when I was doing my report a year later, and hadn't reported by that time, but we were able to go and talk to them, and they were pretty clear at that point that there was nothing to be found. Even so, that conclusion was not entirely clear, because I was asked at the press conference when I published our report, was I absolutely sure that nothing would ever be found in Iraq? And I said I couldn't be absolutely sure, because there was a great deal of sand in the desert of Iraq in which you could bury things. There was some mockery among the media at this answer, but I illustrated, which is in fact the case, that a farmer reported to the Iraq Survey Group that a MiG fighter had been buried in the sand in the area near where he lived. And they went and dug there, and sure enough, they found a MiG fighter. A crazy thing to have done. It was absolutely blocked with sand. It was quite impossible ever to use it again. But that was the sort of thing that the Iraqis had done. So you couldn't rule out that there might have been stuff buried. But the subsequent interrogation of the leading members of the Iraq regime, and indeed of Saddam himself, established that they had indeed destroyed the weapons. But the interesting thing about that is that that interrogation, and it's all there in the report of the Iraq Survey Group, which was brilliantly conducted by a member of the FBI called Pirro, who over 5 months got extremely close to Saddam before Saddam was handed over to the Iraqi government, indicated that Saddam's motives for destroying what was left of his program and not proceeding with it was that his top priority was to get rid of the sanctions, the UN sanctions. And when asked by Pirro, and having got rid of the sanctions, would you have restored the program, he said, you bet I would, because that had been essential to maintaining Iraq's place in the Middle East and its prestige, and indeed his position. So I just mentioned that although there were no weapons, in some respects, and therefore no legal justification in our eyes for the military action, there was another justification, which was that Saddam would indeed have restored his program if action hadn't been taken and he had been allowed to do it. But nonetheless, this was really the most terrible sock in the eye for the world's intelligence communities. And I think that the experience, and this is where I'm going to come to what I describe as in the title of my talk as the lessons, I think that there are huge lessons which should be a textbook, and I hope are a textbook, for those who are aspiring to take part in intelligence in all countries in the future. And I offered my services to give this lecture to apprentice spoons. And, it has been taken up to some extent, but I'm very happy for it to be taken up further. And I will just take you through what I think are the things that we can learn from the experience of what happened in the search for weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and which are applicable to the future. The first thing, of course, is that misled the intelligence community was that Saddam had these weapons. He had form. He had used them. And I think there can't be very many parallels in world history where dictators have had a means of that they've used at their disposal and they have got rid of them. And so there was a natural presumption with which the intelligence agencies started that if Saddam had them, he wouldn't have got rid of them. So they started, as it were, on that hypothesis. And I was interested to see that Jonathan Powell, Tony Blair's chief of staff, giving evidence to our present review yesterday, said, I didn't need the intelligence. He'd had them, and he was not the sort of man who got rid of them. So they started with that mindset. That was point one. Point two, Saddam, as I said earlier, had been acting deceptively, as if he had something to hide. They didn't know what it was he had to hide, but he had been acting as if he had got something to hide. And that was something that swayed the intelligence community. But that leads on, I think, to mistake number three. And that's what's known in the professional jargon as mirror imaging. It is the intelligence assessors on one side projecting themselves into the position of their adversary and supposing that their adversary will behave in the way that they would have behaved if they'd been in his shoes, and not projecting themselves into the way in which that person, with his own history and his own political position, might behave. And the truth was that Saddam wanted the world to believe that he had got the stuff. Although he hadn't, he did actually. Now that seems crazy to us, because there were the Western forces on his border. He must have known that militarily he couldn't resist them, but his position in his own country and the position of Iraq in relation to its neighbors, he had come to think depended critically on people believing that he had got the material. I think there was also something else behind it. He believed that the reasons that the West had drawn back in 1991, after the first Gulf War, from pursuing the Iraqis to Baghdad and toppling Saddam Hussein was because they were sufficiently afraid of the chemical and the biological weapons. That wasn't actually the reason why they weren't pursued, but Saddam believed it was. I also think that the Russians and the French may have been giving him the message that they would obstruct action in the Security Council and the invasion would never take place. All that on Saddam's part showed a great misunderstanding of the West. But we believed, our assessors believed, that he would act rationally and that he wouldn't be so foolish as to continue to maintain the pretense that he had this stuff up to the point of inviting an invasion. And in that, we misunderstood him. The fourth error, again completely comprehensible, was that there is a tendency on the part of intelligence agencies, and it was certainly so in this case, to, in your assessments, to compensate for mistakes you've made before. I mentioned earlier the shock that there had been to the West after the first Gulf War, when it became apparent that Saddam was within a year of having a nuclear weapon. That was a terrible shock, as was the information that Kamal Hussein brought out in 1995 that there was a developing biological weapons program. And the intelligence agencies, understandably, didn't want to make the same mistake again. So there was an element of compensation for previous errors. And the next thing, which I think misled them, and again, this is completely comprehensible when you're leading up to military action, the dangers of underestimating the threat were greater than the dangers of overestimating them. So the intelligence community, in advising the military about what they might face if they invaded Iraq, it would be a much severer mistake to say there are no chemical and biological weapons and the troops to go in and be not equipped to deal with it and to face them. The penalties of that would be much greater than the other way round. Much better to assume that there are those things there to equip your forces and then they're not to have to face them. So I think that also underlay the mistakes that were made. The next mistake is really, in some ways, one that I find particularly interesting. One of the chief arguments, it was presented by Colin Powell to the United Nations, and it was certainly a feature in our assessment, was that the West intelligence, certainly our intelligence, started with an estimate of what stocks of chemical agent Saddam had at the end of the first Gulf War. This estimate was based on a projection of what the stocks would have been if Saddam had gone on producing chemical agent at the rate at which he'd been producing it at the end of the Iran-Iraq war and up to the first Gulf War. And this was then set against the accounts of the stock that had been destroyed, and there was a discrepancy. There was a gap. And so the intelligence said, this can't be accounted for. This must be the stock which Saddam has managed to retain and conceal. What they forgot, or what they overlooked, or what they neglected, was that their original base was only an estimate. And it wasn't the case that Saddam had continued to produce chemical agent at that rate. They'd been too clever for themselves, and there was no gap to be accounted for. The next mistake that was made, I'm glad to say wasn't really made by the British, I think may to some extent have been made by the Americans. And that was neglecting the agenda which your human agents, your human sources in Iraq may have their own private agendas. And you won't need me to tell you, there were lots of people in Iraq, lots of Iraqis with lots of motives for telling the West what they wanted to hear, because they themselves were so anxious to get rid of Saddam Hussein. And in some cases, there were other reasons. Some cases they did it for money, some cases they did it for influence, but there were a lot of people who told the West what it was that they wanted to hear. And I remember that when we were doing our review and we went to Baghdad, and I said to our local Secret Intelligence Service man on the ground in Baghdad at that time, what lessons have you learned from this experience? And he said, one of the lessons I've learned is never to believe anything that any Iraqi tells me ever again. And so there were lots of people who misled them. And the next thing was that we did have some good sources. But the good sources were often reporting what they had been told by other sources. They hadn't got direct knowledge. And it was the second and the third links in the chain that turned out to be unreliable. So the lesson is, however good your sources, don't believe them unless they have got, if they're only reporting somebody else and they haven't got direct information. The next mistake, which tends to particularly happen with alliances, however close, and this is, I think, is also one that if you've followed this subject you will have heard described, is what's called groupthink. The British knew that the CIA and that Mossad, ones of agencies that they particularly respected, believed that Saddam had got a WMD program. We hadn't got intelligence that utterly proved that ourselves. But however close your alliance is with other intelligence communities, with other countries' intelligence people, you are inclined not to trust them completely, because they may have very sensitive sources which they're not prepared to relieve even to their closest allies. And that causes you to think that, well, the US believed this. They haven't produced any absolutely watertight evidence. Mossad believe it. They haven't produced any absolutely watertight evidence, but it's very probable they know something we don't. And so I think there was, among the intelligence communities of the West that were involved, this groupthink and suspecting that other people knew things that they didn't know. And then there were the political pressures. Very strong political pressures, as I said, both on the American and the British side, that as far as the British were concerned, not I think the Americans, as far as the British were concerned, that we would have found it very difficult to act unless the government had had advice that there was intelligence. And although I don't accuse our intelligence community of having been other than objective, underlying it there was the pressure from the politicians for what it was they wanted to hear, and that is bound to be a factor. Then there was the time pressure. The evidence had to be produced because the forces couldn't be there all forever, and producing intelligence against a deadline is always likely to be dangerous. And the final thing, and this was a thing that particularly affected the British, we got a really good agent, or we thought we got a really good agent, very shortly before we published our dossier. This agent was so good that very few people were allowed to know what it was that he had reported. And in particular, the experts in the Ministry of Defence weren't allowed to know what he had reported. This was for very few eyes only, burned before reading, and the director of the SIS gave it to Tony Blair, and it went to the very top people, and they were greatly influenced by it. Afterwards, when it was exposed to the munitions experts in the Ministry of Defence, they said, we could have told you that that was bogus. There are all sorts of internal inconsistencies in it, but it had never been assessed by the real experts because the source was considered too delicate. All those, I think, are the lessons that can be learned from this fiasco. But the final lesson, should we draw the conclusion from this experience that intelligence is so untrustworthy that you really can't rely on it? And my emphatic answer to that is we shouldn't draw that conclusion. The great mistake is if a politician says to you, you must believe this, which is what our politicians did, you must believe this because it's intelligence. You know, we've picked it up. We've heard it from behind the curtain. The fact of the matter is, intelligence is crucial. In an age where you can land weapons on a sixpence, it really is vital to know which sixpence to land them on. So the effort and the expense that we put into intelligence is absolutely crucial. But intelligence is not uniquely worthy of credence. It it's uniquely worthy of skepticism, because you never know whether your adversary knows that you have that he's feeding you with intelligence and has tailored the intelligence accordingly. You've always got to be on the lookout for that and for the other dangers which I have mentioned. So intelligence should never be taken absolutely at face value and by itself. It must be carefully assessed, and it must be treated with skepticism. We have just, in the UK, and this is an episode that is well known, but as a new book's been on it has just been published. We had an intelligence operation in the Second World War called Operation Mincemeat, where we dropped a corpse in the sea off the coast of Spain with plans suggesting that the invasion of Italy was going to go in through the south coast and not through Sicily. And we relied on the Spanish, who were allegedly neutral, but weren't, to hand on this intelligence to the Germans, and it was hugely successful. And the Germans redeployed their forces, and thousands of Allied lives were saved by Hitler taking this bait. So intelligence can be very dangerous, but the one conclusion I would urge from this terrible experience is that people should learn the lessons of the dangers of intelligence, but not abandon the effort to acquire it. Thank you.